I'm the anti-Semite. I do everything, I have colleagues that also work on anti-Semitism in field offices in different parts of the world, but I'm the point person in terms of dealing with anti-Semitism. So I do research, I do, speaking, I do writing, testimony in front of Congress and other commissions, work with law enforcement where appropriate. It's a very varied job. Never a dull day. I hate the idea of hate speech. I don't buy the term. Hate speech suggests that there's certain speech that should be illegal. And I come strongly from an American context that and also, a person who's been working on anti-Semitism for over 2 decades, that suppressing speech never works. It makes people into martyrs, and it gives them more credit than they're due. So I don't like the idea of hate speech at all. If you're asking me, is it anti-Semitism? Is it hateful? Yeah, it is, just like other claims that are anti-Semitic, are hateful. But I think the way you counter them is not to classify them as ideas that shouldn't be allowed, but you encourage people to understand why these things are hateful and to speak out against them, not to criminalize them.
What is your working definition of anti-Semitism, just to lay the groundwork? I know there's all kinds, I know...
Well, what I use is a definition that comes from the European Union Monitoring Center on Antisemitism and Extremism, the EUMC, and it's a long working definition that gives examples for data collectors and so forth. So it includes the classic elements of Jews being seen as conspiring to harm non-Jews and ways of explaining things that are going on in the world, but it gives specific examples too.
Okay. Can you give me a couple examples? I guess, can you narrow down a couple examples here?
Well, sure.
Talking head style.
There's a variety of different aspects to it, because there are really three different types of anti-Semitism. They all have that conspiratorial aspect in common and blaming Jews in that way. But there's the classic religious-based anti-Semitism: Jews killing Christ, poisoning wells. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion type. Then there's the white supremacist, neo-Nazi types of views, and then there's more contemporary things that treat Israel as the classic Jew. Not that criticism of Israel isn't appropriate; it certainly is. But when it uses the same classic tropes as classic anti-Semitism, then that's a problem. And that working definition includes all aspects of those.
Okay, I found a few articles online that you've written, and. One is Anti-Semitism Today, How It Is the Same, How It Is Different, and How to Fight It. Could you please synopsize that, the central issue there, how it's the same, how it's different?
Well, this one's actually a book that I wrote in 2006, and the interesting thing is that when I was starting to think about writing the book, it was really around the time of 2000 when the general view in the Jewish world was that anti-Semitism really wasn't a big deal anymore, that intermarriage was the big problem. Joseph Lieberman was running as a vice presidential candidate. There wasn't much in the way of mainstream pushback to that. So the general view in the Jewish community was that anti-Semitism was dead. And then a couple of years later, after the collapse of the peace process and the Second Intifada, there was a general view that things are resembling the 1930s, which wasn't true either. So the purpose of the book was really to try to gauge where anti-Semitism is. I mean, it's a thing that's been around for 2,000 years. It's slated to declare victory. Yet every time there's a spike in it, it also doesn't mean that it's the same as the darkest days in Jewish history. As a practical matter, anti-Semitism morphs. The same basic premises exist that sees Jews as trying to conspire to harm non-Jews. But there are new theories that help give it life, whether it's Holocaust denial or post 9/11, the idea that Jews somehow got advance notice and inflicted the damage of the 9/11 on the world. So there are newer storylines that tell the same conspiracy theories, but the conspiracy theories are still very much a part of it.
Okay. You wrote an article, I believe an article, called Anti-Zionism, the Sophisticated Antisemitism. I've spoken with a few people already about this range of thing, but could you give me your feedback on that, please?
Well, that was actually an old publication that I wrote, I think in 1991, or 1990, and the gist of that was to try to push for the repeal of the Zionism racism resolution at the UN. And it was to demonstrate how anti-Zionism in the context of claiming that the Jewish enterprise, of Zionism was somehow a racist enterprise, was in itself anti-Semitic and racist and bigoted, and how to understand it and refute it. And in fact, what happened was that the UN, after the Soviet Union collapsed and countries came out under the thumb of communism, the UN did vote to undo that. The problem with that publication was the presumption was that somehow when this resolution was repealed, that ought to take care of that equation. And it's not in fact the case. I mean, we've seen it in a number of times, especially in the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, how the attempt to make the idea that Jewish self-determination, alone of all the self-determinations on the globe, is somehow racist, has life, and will continue, unfortunately, to have some.
You start this piece, the anti-Zionism piece,
Mm-hmm.
By quoting a journalist, Claude Lewis. I don't know. Again, I'm throwing things in your lap.
I haven't read it. I wrote 20 years ago, right?
Oh, yeah. So forgive me, but nonetheless, I still like to see where you go.
Sure.
And what the thing was, the journalist, you started it with a quote by Claude Lewis, who said, "It is the perpetual trick of the racist to force his victim to appear to be the hater."
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I think most people don't like to see themselves as ones that are promoting hate. So it's not just anti-Semitism. If you look at all forms of hatred, especially ones that have a political context, it's usually put in a spin that makes it seem not only not hateful, but somehow valiant and important. So if you see, David Duke, who's a white supremacist and anti-Semite, he won't talk about his hatred of black people and Jews as somehow a demeaning thing. He will say that he's actually just trying to look out for white people who he loves. Or you have Louis Farrakhan, who also demonizes whites and Jews, and will say the same thing. He says, "I don't hate Jews, I don't hate white people, I just love black people." So there's perpetually, in at least in my reading of history, when bigotry is being promoted, it's usually done with a spin that makes it seem that it's somehow a noble thing. And when you add theology onto the ideology of it, when people say that it's not only is it important for how the world works, but it's also God-pleasing that I'm articulating these things, then it becomes even more troublesome.
Okay. You write about a lot of these issues, and that's why I'm visiting you.
Sure.
Thank you again. You talk about how would you define a hate group, quote, hate group, and you allude to a few things. Again, you may not recall the details,
sure.
but could you give me some?
A hate group, well, it's like it sounds. It's a group of people that coalesces around an ideology of vilifying another. And there are certainly groups that we can think of off the top of our head, like the Ku Klux Klan and others that organize for this purpose and try to actually impact communities in which they operate, or the discourse of people in different communities. So it's again not just the idea of a hate group. It's just not the isolated subjective view of hatred, but it's also the using it in a way that's trying to organize to have an impact on a community. So we've seen them different times. So the militias in the 1990s, I would characterize them as hate groups. They weren't particularly concerned with Jews, they were vilifying federal officials, or you have other groups in again, in the far right and far left.
Okay, one thing you bring out more than once, I think, the idea of the other, and you even say it's the idea. Sometimes you say sometimes I'm tempted to use the word otherism. Do you address that?
Well, I mean, that comes out of the idea of the need for interdisciplinary approach to looking at issues of hatred, which is one of the things that I'm very excited about, being involved in the building of a field of hate studies. And it's precisely, I think, that we tend to think that somehow hatred and vilification of others is an abnormal thing. The AJC has a poster of cuddly little babies in different skin color and diapers that we use after hate crimes with the caption, "No one is born hating." And I think that sends the absolute wrong message, because no one is born speaking either, but at a certain time I think it's sort of unusual. People don't have that capacity. So I think the idea of defining people as quote others, and sometimes even vilifying them and leading to genocide, it can be and is a sort of normative part of the human experience. We may need some help, and some hate groups and others and leaders may give us some ideas of who to hate and why to hate. But the idea that somehow we define groups as others and see them as somehow a threat to us, I think has been a normative part of human history, regardless of any other variable.
And you're active in building a field of hate studies. I mean, could you elaborate on some of the essentials of that?
Sure. Well, the idea is that if you accept the notion of hatred as a normative part of human experience, then why don't we treat it the same way as we do other aspects of human experience? For example, people get sick. So you have a field of medicine that's really more than a combination of its disparate academic parts, chemistry and biology and other related fields. Or you have schools of architecture, because people need structures, and that's more than simply throwing together art and physics and math and the other fields that you need to build a school of architecture. But we don't look at hatred that way. It's more isolated, tangential inquiries. Why does a person hate? What's the psychology of it? How does it work in sociology? How does it work in history? And if we talk to people in these fields, they're all in their silos, not talking together, so that there's really no structure to help put together testable theories of how human rights groups, governments, others in society should be understanding and dealing with hatred and somehow hoping to reduce it.
So it's sort of a holistic view of...
Well, it's an interdisciplinary idea. The idea is, let's work backwards from the fact that we should be producing theories to help us figure out how to understand and deal with hatred. Then how do you get the different fields to cooperate and to see this as a sort of intellectual umbrella around a lot of good work that's happening in isolation, but to put it together to a common purpose. And so there's an Institute for Hate Studies, there's a Journal of Hate Studies, and it's about 10 years old, and we hope to see it continue and grow.
Are you involved in that?
Oh, yeah, I'm on the board of the Institute for Hate Studies, and we just had our second international conference a couple of months ago, and we're starting to see a couple of courses in interdisciplinary team-taught courses in hatred, and the plan is to see if we can get many other universities to offer these as well in the coming years.
I interviewed Brian Levin.
Brian's a good friend, yes.
Is he? Okay, I interviewed him a few months ago. And I asked him this, and many individuals of Jewish heritage are involved. I mean, relatively, a goodly number. Why is that? Is that a matter of history? And
well,
what's your take?
I don't know that I have an answer. I mean, the Institute for Hate Studies, actually the one place that liked this idea and decided to adopt it and run with it is at Gonzaga, which is a Jesuit school. So it's not just Jews. I think a lot of people see the value in these types of approaches. But I think you're right. There are a lot of people from the Jewish community who, for one reason or another, saw either anti-Semitism, or in my background, seeing not only anti-Semitism but bigotry against others as something that is deplorable and just really mind-boggling stupid, and wanting to figure out better ways of how to confront it. And that may come from religious things, may come from upbringing, may come from ideas of repairing the world, I don't know. But the other is certain people like Brian and many others that have invested a lot of time and energy into this.
Sensitivity to this, a special sensitivity? Or?
Well, I don't know. I think that again, I haven't seen a sociological, research into why people choose to go into these fields. But I think that I've seen overrepresentation of Jews in combating bigotry, but then again, my prior life was as a trial lawyer working on a lot of political cases, and Jews were overrepresented there too. So again, it may be part of trying to make the world a better place, but I'll leave it to my wife, the rabbi, to answer.
Okay. Again, I'm throwing quotes
Sure,
you
fine, sure.
wrote, and you might not even remember them.
Sure.
This is a quote from you. Freedom from anti-Semitism must be a human right.
Mm-hmm.
Could you address that?
Well, I think that sometimes anti-Semitism isn't seen as serious a form of hatred and bigotry as some others. And there's a framework for understanding how bigotry works in the human rights field, to see that one should not be discriminated against, one should not be vilified, whether on the basis of religion or sex or ethnicity and so forth. And I think anti-Semitism needs to be seen as a part of that too. There are too many times where I've talked about anti-Semitism where people, especially in the context of modern anti-Semitism, again, try to poo-poo it and say it isn't really that serious, it's not as serious as some others. And I think that's especially if somebody's victimized by it, if I see it on a college campus, for example, or other places where people, will go out to other people that ought to understand, hey, this is what just happened to me. It's very similar what happened to you as a gay person, or what happened to you as an African American, or what happened, to you as a Latino, and somehow it gets, diminished because it's put in the, a white versus people of color paradigm, or it gets somehow otherwise seen as not as serious, and that sort of doubles on the hurt that these people have when the people that ought to be supportive of them somehow say, it's not so bad that what you're doing, even if it's the same thing that happened to me, it would be pretty horrible.
Forgive me, I'm going to hop
Sure.
on a little bit. Certain
Sure.
things trigger things. And you had written somewhat about the idea of the Holocaust being diminished as a form of Holocaust denial, or in that ballpark. Could you elaborate on that? What
Sure.
your thoughts are on that?
Sure. Well, most anti-Semitism, and probably most forms of bigotry that are fueled by stories or tropes, frequently have a hardcore version and a lightcore version. If you have the protocols of the elders of Zion, the Jews control everything that happens in the world, and then you have, the Jews control the Bush White House, for example. Okay, it's not eternal, it's not all the time, but it's again the same storyline, but in a more circumspect and prescribed area. Well, the same thing with Holocaust denial, that the Jews just somehow invented the Holocaust to, again, as part of a conspiracy to harm non-Jewish people. That's the hardcore version. The lightcore version basically says Jews, the Holocaust happened, but so did concentration camps in the United States. Well, it's true, concentration camps happened in the United States for Japanese Americans, but one people were being summarily killed and the other they weren't. So I remember going to a conference of a group that was fighting actually the far right in the Pacific Northwest, and there was a speaker who was an American Indian woman who just sort of gratuitously said, well, Hitler couldn't find himself Indian, so he went after Jews, which was, preposterous, and why she needed to say that, I don't know. And then there's a Mexican-American poet who said that he was complaining about teachers that have very low expectation of Latino children as a form of racism, which I have no problem with him articulating. I agree with him in terms of what he was asserting. But then he went on to say, well, this is worse than the Holocaust, because the Holocaust attacked people's bodies, this attacked people's minds, and he went off on, well, there was no need to make that comparison, and I'm sitting there thinking, well, it's just partly ignorance, because he because this is not the same as, I suspect kids who were killed in the Holocaust would have loved to have had a racist teacher as an alternative. And then he was talking about the deportations in the 30s of farm laborers as being the same as the Holocaust. And I'm thinking, okay, it was horrible in terms of what happened, but people, when they were pushed over the border, weren't summarily shot. So there's this too easy symmetry in terms of other evils with the Holocaust, which I see as a diminution of it, and that creates an environment where the hardcore stuff is more possible, and some anti-Semitic views of the world are also more possible.
Just a little tangential,
Sure.
You're hitting on this, but you said, quote, "It has become politically correct to see all genocides as Holocausts and all Holocausts as indistinguishable."
Mm-hmm. I think the idea that every genocide is the same as the Holocaust, to me, is troubling on two levels. One is that part of the reason for people making that assertion is to sort of diminish the Holocaust on one sense, and second, I can't fathom why somebody would want to compare genocides, because to me, each of them are unique, and we have something to learn from each of them, and I don't know on what scale you compare. I mean, if you take something like slavery and compare it to the Holocaust, which is worse? Is one that went on for, a number of years in the middle of the 20th century, or one that went on, for hundreds of years? How do you compare the Middle Passage to Auschwitz? I mean, I don't know on what scale people would do that. So to me, the commonality of the genocides is that people saw other people as less than human and were willing to treat them as chattel or as objects that needed to be killed. And the rest of society let it happen. And sometimes, a variety of countries and other institutions were fully supportive of it. And to see them as all homogenized means that we don't learn as much as we can from each of them.
Okay, thank you. Again, another quote.
Sure.
I'm sure you may not remember this, but you probably remember the idea.
Uh-huh.
You say the principal ideological connection between right-wing neo-Nazis promoting Holocaust denial and those who do the same on the left is hatred of Israel. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, that's the connective tissue. I mean, right-wing people, the neo-Nazi crowd, loved Hitler, loved what he did and so forth, and have spun out a lot of Holocaust denial, right? The connective tissue, I mean, it's hard to see, there's not much Holocaust denial on the left per se, but the connective tissue is with the, well, let me start that again. Let me get that, because
you said the principal ideological connection between, I'm taking it out of context.
Sure, okay.
The principal ideological connection between right-wing neo-Nazis promoting Holocaust denial and those who do the same on the left is hatred of Israel.
Okay, but I don't know where I said, the difference is that on the left there isn't much strong Holocaust denial, okay? The right-wing folks deny the Holocaust because they like what Hitler did. The left has problems with Israel, or at least some people on the left have problems with Israel. But the denial of the Holocaust isn't really much there. The way that it's really connected is in a double standard in a way. For example, if you had a neo-Nazi marching in the streets of the UK with a banner saying the Holocaust didn't happen, you would have people on the left saying, this is awful, this is deplorable, and so forth. If you had a young Muslim marching with the banner that said the same thing, which had happened, on the left you would have, gee, he's just as uneducated, he doesn't understand, giving excuses for him. That's a level of racism, I think, to treat a young Muslim in the same way as you would a young white person. But it's also a level of anti-Semitism that's a problem in the sense that it has a double standard. I mean, we saw the same thing, for example, at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban. You had groups handing out classic anti-Semitic tracts, including the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Okay, if it was the neo-Nazis doing it someplace, you would have had sort of unanimity of people that were the representatives of the NGOs there saying this is horrible. You have people making excuses when it was Arabs doing it. So the anti-Israel aspect of things gives a different standard of where people on the right and where the left are, but it is a connective tissue where it applies even more with the far right, which is the sort of the progenitor of Holocaust denial, is a connection with the Muslim world, where you also see Holocaust denial, because there's a political context there. For the far right, it's the idea that they liked Hitler's program, and this is a way of creating yet another myth of Jews, harming non-Jews, making up this history, and so forth. For people in the Arab and Muslim world, it also gives them an extra reason to not like the existence of Israel. They say, well, part of the justification for Israel, is the fact of the Holocaust. Now, Israel, the Zionist enterprise long predated the Holocaust. There's been a Jewish presence there for thousands of years. But to the extent that politically the Holocaust helped create the state of Israel in the aftermath, that there's obviously some truth to that. So the folks who see Holocaust denial in the Muslim world as an attractive philosophy are attracted to it, not only because of its anti-Semitic component, but also the political component that says, see, why should we be paying for what happened in Europe, and on top of that didn't happen too. And that's where the connection comes about.
Okay. This is a controversial issue. I'd really like your feedback on this. Is there such a thing as a Jewish anti-Semite? And I've interviewed Sandra Gilman, whose self-hatred book is sort of a classic, I guess. Yeah. But what's your take on that?
I think there could be female sexist. I think there could be black racist, and I think there could be Jewish anti-Semites. Just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you can't have a certain set of ideas. To me, that actually the Jewish anti-Semites, like black racist and female sexists, are frequently used to put forward to say, look, these ideas can't be sexist, racist, anti-Semitic, because look, I'm a black or a woman, or I'm a Jew, and I'm saying these things too. So those people tend to get promoted, and sometimes to use their own background as a way of saying I should have more credibility on this. But the ideas are the same. Just because you're born Jewish, born black, or born female doesn't mean you're somehow immune from the ideas that drive these types of hatred.
Maybe this will segue into you co-authored an article with Carrie Nelson, which in some quarters I guess is controversial. At least there have been rebuttals online. And could you address that? What that's all about? Title VI? Could you address?
It's a little different subject, but sure. Yeah. Basically, there's a thing called Title VI, which is a federal protection for education in terms of anti-discrimination. Okay, and there's been a question about whether Jews are covered or not, because religion isn't covered, but ethnicity is, and whether Jews are covered in this as blacks and other ethnic groups are. And under the Clinton administration it was, and then it wasn't, and now in this administration there was a letter that came out in October that said Jews should be considered as part of that coverage as appropriate. And AJC was very instrumental in convening the group that pushed that. What my concern was that there are some that are using this protection and the working definition of anti-Semitism, which I mentioned to you earlier, as a way to create a de facto hate speech code, which is a horrible way and a really disastrous way to try to treat anti-Semitism on campus. The last thing you want to do on a college campus in particular, when you have an idea that may be problematic, which anti-Semitic ideas are, is to say that we're going to threaten your funding if those ideas are heard. Because a campus is a place where all ideas should be heard, and if campus works well, they should be exposed. And when you send the dynamic that instead of dealing with these ideas head on, you want to have the provost and the president and others go lawyer up, I think that harms Jewish students. So that was the basic idea. That what was happening was that there were some groups that were taking this working definition that had some examples about where anti-Semitism might exist in the context of Israel, holding all Jews responsible for the actions of Israel, declaring that Zionism is a racist enterprise, comparing Israel to the Nazis and so forth as examples of anti-Semitism, which may be and should be cataloged, and the working definition is a great tool for encouraging discussion about why is this or is this not anti-Semitism when you may hear that on a campus. Instead, to try to say, if that's uttered, that's the end of the game, your federal funding is at risk. And so what I did with Carrie Nelson is wrote a piece that articulated that that's not a bright way to go, because it would be ending up turning all the faculty and others to defend the free speech rights of people that are saying hateful things, and not using the institutions of the university to combat the hatred. Because it's more, people are seeing other faculty members and other people there that want to say things as representing their rights to say what they want to. So it's just a bad strategic view, and it doesn't make sense legally and doesn't make sense politically.
Where do you stand on a group like Campus Watch? I interviewed Daniel Pipes. What's your position? It's part of this realm here.
Yeah, I think, look, a couple things on campus, right? Should I tell my daughter to stop? Yeah, hold on a second. Anyway, so Campus Watch. There is a concern with a variety of professors who teach propaganda more than scholarship. However, the idea of somehow monitoring them in a way that encourages people to go into the classes and sit in and so forth, I think is, to me, a view that would backfire. The better approach, to my way of thinking, is what Brandeis has done, which is saying, okay, there's a problem here with credible scholarship on the modern Middle East. Let's go and spend some time and money and educate professors to teach about modern Israel. They don't have to be people that are supportive of Israeli policy, but to really increase the level of scholarship and the number of people that are teaching about this. And so every year, I think there are about 20 new professors being trained with letters from their deans or provosts promising they can teach courses every summer. And that, to me, is a much better way to try to change the discourse where it may be problematic. I've spoken to college presidents where the discourse on a campus is on one side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm the last person that's going to say that you have to tell a professor to teach something differently in his or her class. But I will say, because I don't think students need balance. I think they need to be shaken up. But I will say to a president, if you're not having a credible theory in a field taught in any course, whether it's physics or math or anything else, and the professors there aren't offering it, you have the responsibility to make sure it's being offered, either by bringing in outside professors, visiting professors, or holding colloquium or other ways. But to try to tell an individual professor, this is what you have to teach in a class, to me, is just something, again, that's it's designed to backfire, because it gets all the other academics seeing their right to teach what they want in their class as somehow in jeopardy, and I understand it.
Okay. It comes up a lot, the term, the new anti-Semitism, and it seems to revolve around Israel and the Islamic world. But could you give me?
Yeah, I don't like that term, new anti-Semitism. When I first started seeing it bandied about, well, first of all, it's not a new term. It was used in the 1970s. But when it started being bandied about, about 10 years ago, I started thinking, new and improved, like laundry detergent, right? It's not new anti-Semitism. It's the same old anti-Semitism in new circumstances. So, you may have additional tropes, and you may have, in the context of Israel, the idea of treating Israel as the classic Jew, which is what the new anti-Semitism is made to. But I think to the extent that people suggest that somehow there's a leap, that it's something different, harms us when we intellectually try to understand and not only what's going on, but figure out what to do about it. Because the connection to the 2,000 plus year history of anti-Semitism, to me, seems very clear. That when Israel is being treated in a way that is beyond the pale, and treated in a way that the classic Jew has been treated, that is either ghettoized, or now you have the boycott divestment sanction movement, and you have to look at it in the history, okay, boycotts against Jews in history and so forth. You want to make the connections of where it flows from things that have happened for thousands of years, as opposed to saying that there's some sort of quantum leap in a way that I don't see as either being justified intellectually or just by the facts.
Okay, so then what do you see as essences that remain the same in terms of the attacks on Israel and the attacks on Jews?
Well, I remember growing up. Especially post '67, leading to the Zionism, racism, Resolution 75. So to me, those and the UN as a bloc, with its the Human Rights Council and other parts of it also being used as a way to vilify Israel in a way no other country is being done. I mean, I see those things as happening for political reasons. And coming out of, if you get a look at the Zionism racism resolution, what it came out of was the Soviet Union was upset when there was a resolution, there was an anti-racism resolution that was being proposed that was targeting them for how they were behaving, and that they were trying to deflect attention from them. That's where the idea of the Zionism racism resolution came about. It's all political. It had to deal with a lot of how the Russians were dealing with the anti-Semitism back in the early 70s, and so again, I don't see anything as horribly new here.
Okay. May I ask? You discuss again. I'm throwing things
Sure,
out of the past at you. Here's a quote. You said the quarantine strategy of the 1930s and 1950s and the exposure strategy of the 1980s and 1990s were both dependent on the outside media. Could you elaborate on those and how the fight against anti-Semitism is changing?
Well, I think it's changing. I mean, the quarantine theory was basically if nobody saw it, it would disappear. It's the sort of ostrich, head in the ground theory, and to an extent it worked. I mean, I know that there were times where if you had a Jewish agency in a different community and a Klan group came to town, and you would go to the newspaper editor and say it would really, be better if you didn't cover it because here's what's, going to happen. Sometimes they would decide not to cover it, and that, made things easier. And there's sometimes, that it's still a strategy. If there's somebody who's going to, draw 3 people into a meeting, you don't want to publicize it to, it'll be to their benefit. And it's not just anti-Semitism, any type of bigotry and hatred. Okay. In the 80s and 90s, when you started getting more, especially late 90s and even further now, that you're not dependent on the media as much for information, especially now in the internet age. What you're trying to do is to use ways of exposing these groups. For example, when you have a group that, like a Holocaust denial group that comes into a community, you don't want to debate it. You don't want to, because that creates the impression that they win in the sense because they're saying, well, we could have a reasonable discussion about did the Holocaust happen or didn't happen, which is what they want. But when you try to expose them, in other words, to show, like the David Irving trial showed, how Holocaust deniers take things out of context intentionally, mistranslate, basically lie, cheat, and steal to make their case. You can, sometimes educate people in terms of how that particular type of anti-Semitism works. But again, it depends on the context. And a lot of times in my day-to-day work, you make those judgments about, is it best to not respond to something, directly? Is it best to try to respond to it in a way that doesn't get publicity, but to try to get, if it's law enforcement or other groups in a community to understand about it? Or is it sometimes better to do something much more public? And each of those is on a sort of case-by-case basis. But the default back in the 50s and 60s was always underground, and it's not the most effective way nowadays in all cases.
Okay. Again, you may not remember this, but maybe you do. You had a list of advice, points of advice on how to fight hate groups and stuff. And one of the things was don't provide hate groups any more free publicity. Yeah,
right.
And what I want to ask you about is that's very difficult to grapple with the issue without mentioning it. Could you elaborate further on that in any case?
Well, I mean, again, it depends on the context. If it's a hate group coming into a town that's not going to get any notice, you know, you don't necessarily want it to get noticed. What you may want to do is find out, say David Irving is a Holocaust denier, comes into a community. If he's going to draw 5 or 10 people, mostly, you know, in their 70s, getting autographed copies of his Goebbels book, and he's trying to get people to notice the fact that he's there, you know, I'm not going to give him publicity. What I may tell a local community to do is see if you can get somebody to come into that group and just see who's there. Because, you know, there may be some local people that are going to, you know, stay, and you may want to know about that, whether it might be, you know, some kids from the local high school, or it may be the formation of a small neo-Nazi group in the community, you know, especially in certain parts of the country. So, you know, exposing it isn't always the best thing to do.
Okay. Could you address the new problems that the internet poses to fight hate?
Well, the internet it's very interesting. First of all, I think the allegation that the internet has been a tremendous promoter of hatred is not entirely correct. Especially early on, people were talking about how many, you know, hate groups there were online. Well, you know, it's still a number that's a relative small number, a number of thousands. Well, there's, you know, over 1 billion sites, and now you have all the social media stuff on there too. So it's a very small percentage, and you know, it represented sometimes one person, you know, by him or herself doing something that may look good online, but doesn't really, you know, reflect how many people are actually being attracted to it or motivated by it. And there was some anecdotal information at the beginning that, especially of the, you know, the hate sites, that it may have actually been a beneficial thing, because instead of having people coming together, sharing their ideologies of hate over some beers and deciding who to go and beat up, they're all sitting by their computer terminals on, you know, isolated function. So that's one aspect of it. What it does, it's a culture for rumor, and so it allows communication to be, you know, much quicker and without the filters of credibility in some ways. So it does allow some impression for people on the far right that they're stronger than they really are, because of the sort of bravado and the sort of chiming on that you can do on the internet. So it is a mixed bag. On the other hand, you know, even back at the early days in the mid-90s, when things were just starting, they were back at the time of Usenet groups were the big thing for the far right. Yeah, it may have been useful for them to organize on some of the malicious stuff. It was probably easier for them to do it that way than to send out faxes or have phone trees and so forth. But it also allowed a bunch of us who were watching them to get a real good feel of what was going on, which was why, you know, it was very easy for me to put out a report actually 2 weeks before the Oklahoma City bombing, talking about the likelihood of some attack on government. I didn't, you know, presume anything of that scale. But it was clear that something was likely to happen, because we were able to watch the sort of temperature rise in these communications of really were paranoid and very violent and threatening. So it gave a tool to watch it too. So it's a mixed bag.
So what is your role at the HAC? Is it research, monitoring?
I'm the anti-Semite. I do everything. I have colleagues that also work on anti-Semitism in field offices in different parts of the world, but I'm the point person in terms of dealing with anti-Semitism. So I do research, I do speaking, I do writing, testimony in front of Congress and other commissions, work with law enforcement where appropriate. It's a very varied job. Mm-hmm. Never a dull day.
Any interesting examples from that mix that you could share?
I've spoke at a White House conference on hate crimes, which was, under the Clinton administration, which I thought was a great opportunity that he put forward to try to get people to understand what hate crimes were and how to deal with them. I was a key drafter of that working definition for the EUMC. I've had lots of different experiences with different community groups to help them organize about anti-Semitism. I've worked with college presidents, worked with people on the left in terms of how to beat back some of the anti-Semitic things that come in the guise of anti-Israelism. So it's very varied. I've been doing it for over 20 years.
So you were involved in the actual creation of the definition
Yeah.
of antisemitism. What are some of the things that could go on? Can you get a sense of?
I can give you a copy of it, but the basic idea was this: there was after the peace process collapsed in 2000. You may remember there was a spike in anti-Semitic incidents, particularly in France and in the UK, but other parts of Europe, and in fact, for a little while in North America as well. But it continued in France and in England in particular, and some other parts of Europe. So there's a group called the European Monitoring Center on Xenophobia and Racism, which is now subsumed into something else called the Fundamental Rights Agencies of the EU. But that group was tasked with looking at issues of anti-Semitism and monitoring it. And they commissioned a report that was, the first one was suppressed because it showed there was some of the activity still was the neo-Nazi type, but some of it was young Arab and Muslim youth were perpetrating some of the attacks on synagogues and so forth. That one was ultimately released, but then they did another one on their own that really showed more of the a credible understanding of what the problem was and how these incidents were happening. But what was troubling about it was two things. One is that the report noted that in terms of how do you collect data on anti-Semitism, most countries in Europe didn't have a definition of what to include and exclude, and those that did, the few that did, they were no two the same. So if you're trying to look at it Europe-wide, there was no real way to have the same standard in different places. Okay. The second thing that was problematic was that it gave a definition that it was using as best as it could to guide it, and the definition looked at anti-Semitism as a series of stereotypes about Jews. Jews are clannish, greedy, all the traditional types of stereotypes. And they said, well, that defines anti-Semitism. For me, it's backwards, because those things are derivative of what anti-Semitism is, as opposed to its defining characteristics. But the larger problem was that it tried to figure out, what do you do about a Jew who's beaten up on the streets of Paris as a stand-in for an Israeli? And what the report concluded was, well, if the person who attacks the Jew there has these feelings about Israelis that are the classical anti-Semitic stereotypes and transposes that on the Jew in front of them in the street of Paris, that's anti-Semitism. But if somehow they're upset about Israeli policy and picks on this poor Jew on the street of Paris, that's not anti-Semitism. Well, I grew up in the 50s and 60s in the US, and I'm thinking, well, does that mean if somebody, catches a black person in 1961 Alabama and strings him up on a magnolia tree because he thinks blacks are shiftless and lazy, that's racism? But if he's upset at a Martin Luther King speech or the passage of a Civil Rights Act, that's not racism if he, kills the same poor guy in the same way? So there were a bunch of us that decided to work with the EUMC to try to put together a definition that would be useful for the data collectors to know what to include and what to exclude, and also dealt with, if a Jew is attacked because he's a Jew, you shouldn't need to psychoanalyze the view of the perpetrator. It's just like any other hate crime, where if a person's selected based on who they are, that should be enough. And there was a situation, for example, there was in Montreal, there was a Jewish elementary school that was firebombed in reaction to the Israeli assassination of a Hamas leader. Clearly, anti-Semitism would not have been under the prior definition. It is under, this one. There was a kidnapping and torture of a Jewish person in France, where the stereotype was all Jews are rich, we're going to hold them for ransom. Not one of those negative stereotypes, but still he was selected because he was Jewish. So it tried to put some common sense into this. And on the Israel stuff, it clearly states criticism of Israel as any other democracy cannot be understood as anti-Semitism. But when you compare Israeli actions to that of the Nazis or hold all Jews collectively responsible, things like that can be included.
Okay. So the issue of comparing Israeli policy to the Nazis, could you address that?
Well, that's sort of become, a sort of standard trope of some people on the far left. And what it does, I mean, you can criticize Israeli policy. I mean, there's no question that there are policies that are open to criticism, and you read the Israeli press, they're open to criticism. But to say that the treatment of Palestinians, as much as one may not like what goes on a day-to-day basis and even on a policy basis, is not to say that that's the same as somehow rounding them up, taking them to places where they're going to be gassed to death or shot in pits and burned, and in an attempt to exterminate them as a group. To say those things only can be made, for the purpose of trying to vilify Israelis and creating the impression that just like Nazism shouldn't exist, Israel shouldn't exist.
Okay, you talk about political anti-Semites and political anti-Semitism, and to quote you, the political anti-Semite has no problem with an individual Jew. It is a collective identity of Jews expressed in Israel and all that. Could you elaborate on that, please? Your idea of political.
Well, I mean, the idea is to show that it's somehow related to but different than the classical forms of anti-Semitism. And by political, it dovetails with something called the new anti-Semitism. It's looking at Israel as, again, the stand-in for the classical Jew. And the point is that somebody who might have a problem with one of the classical versions of anti-Semitism, saying, they would say, Jews killing Christ, or Jews is somehow trying to control the world, that type of stuff, is problematic. They hold things about Israel to a different standard. They will allow those types of things to be said. And my point is that anti-Semitism and any of its flavors, because there's really just different flavors of anti-Semitism, have to be seen with the same seriousness. So for political reasons, sometimes people try to not look at this other aspect of anti-Semitism, where they may get it when it comes to the first two. And to me, that's a problem, because they're all related.
Okay. Could you address some anti-Semitic stereotypes that inform criticism of Israel?
That somehow the Israelis control U.S. foreign policy, that the idea that Jews should not have a right to self-determination, that Jews should just be seen as a religion, not as a people. Again, trying to ghettoize Jews. In other words, classically, Jews were tolerated, but as a minority and ghettoized and not allowed national self-expression. The idea that one small country where you have a Jewish sovereignty is somehow a problem that defines everything else that goes wrong in the world. That somehow if Israel didn't exist, the world would be a better place. Resonates in the same type of trope that said, well, Jews are causing all sorts of problems inside these various European countries in the 1800s and 1900s, and somehow if they didn't exist, the world will be a better place.
Okay. You talk about white supremacists, and you say, quote, that they see Jews as responsible for opening the door to equal rights and opportunity as part of a nefarious plot to destroy white America and on. And could you discuss that? Well,
sure. I mean, there's and that type of anti-Semitism is one that I worry in another 20, 30 years may be on the ascendancy in the United States. Because white supremacists, they don't like Jews, but they don't like people of color either. And they're probably more animated by their dislike of people of color. But the United States is going to be, by 2050, if you believe the demographic projections, a majority non-white society. And if you have people who look at this ideologically, I mean, for most of us, we're all Americans who could care less. But for these folks for whom their racial identity is the driving force of who they are and supersede any other aspect of their identity, they're worried about this. And they also define themselves as superior to these people that they see themselves losing out to. So how can you lose to somebody that you see as inferior to you? Well, there has to be some other wild card in this. And for these folks, they see it as part of a Jewish plot to do what they see Jews have always done historically. They see Jews as trying to destroy other groups. In this way, Jews trying to destroy the white gene pool. That's what David Duke talks about. That's what others see. And that's why I see as the immigration debate continues to heat up in the United States, I see it as a way, at least for some of the movers and shakers, to attract more people to ideologies of anti-Semitism.
Is that, and what is the greatest threat, or maybe threats are too strong a word, but where is the greatest problem right now in the anti-Semitic world?
There are a lot. I mean, it depends on where you are in the world. I mean, if you're in the UK, or France, you're worried about particularly hate crimes, especially the next time something blows up in the Middle East, because you can see a clear uptick in that. In the United States, things aren't that bad by any means, but you worry about whether Islamic extremism is one threat that you worry about here on the tendency, and you worry about white supremacist extremism down the road as well. Again, because it defines Jews as somehow being behind the scenes, making changes that people find very frightening. And there are theologies and ideologies out there that we saw have minimal traction on, but on the extreme, but extremely dangerous. Back in the militia days, even though Jews weren't very much a direct target, the movers and shakers of that were people from what was called the Christian identity movement, that believed that there was a failed creation, and that blacks and other minorities were part of that failed creation. There was another creation where God created Adam and Eve, and Eve's impregnated by Adam produced white Aryan people, and Eve impregnated by Satan produced the Jews. And so these folks have Jews as literally demonic. And there are people that were very much aligned with that movement that had a lot of sway in the formation of the militias. And the posse comitatus before that, and you wonder, back in the 80s during the farm crisis when there was a lot of anti-Semitism. Akin to Christian identity, there's something called Christian patriotism, which the difference is if you could be a Christian identity adherent and live in Australia or England or wherever. Christian patriotism believes that pretty much the same thing, but it sees it as an American phenomenon, that the Constitution was divinely inspired and for white Nordic Aryan types, and that the first 10 amendments were, God created too, but everything after that, the freeing of the slaves and equal rights amendment and so forth, were sacrilegious. Well, most of these people swim in the same pool. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were going to militia meetings and associating with some of these groups, and Nichols himself was a Christian patriot. So, we have some history to be aware that at least some of these ideas can have traction. Some of the Aryan nations in northern Idaho. So you worry about whether what's been a fringe phenomenon with some violent, dangerous tendencies might, in a different context with a different demographic in the United States, and people feeling more afraid down 20, 30, 40 years from now. I'm worried about not me or you, I'm worried about grandkids might have more of that to face.
How do the current economic problems affect anti-Semitism?
I think it's been one of the things that people tend to believe that's demonstrably wrong, that economics somehow explains anti-Semitism or any form of hatred. It may be an exacerbating catalytic thing under certain circumstances, but just look back in the U.S. history. The time that the Klan had its heyday was the 1920s. Okay, the Roaring 20s. You had 40,000 members of the clergy of the United States that belonged to the Klan. The Klan basically took over the Oregon state, government machinery. The Klan was huge. That was the time of, economic prosperity. The Depression, it wasn't as much so. So there are very few studies that indicate any correlation with economic downturns. And it's not just a question of how much money people have in their pockets, it's how ideas have currency and how ideas are seen by respected institutions in society. Are hateful ideas ones that are endorsed by mainstream people, by leaders, by clergy, by others, or are hateful ideas ones that people say that this doesn't represent us? And I think that's, to me, the much more important determinative thing about how people respond to hatred when it does appear, as opposed to, is the economy going up or is the economy going down?
Okay, so how can groups like the AJC influence or have some control over these problems?
Well, the way I see it is, what my job is mostly to try to create additional understanding and capacity in other institutions in terms of how they deal with anti-Semitism and bigotry more effectively. So, I have colleagues that do a lot of diplomatic work. We have meetings with the UN, foreign ministers and so forth, and when they come into the UN in the fall every year, I think 60, 70 different countries. And part of the message that we share with them is the need for them to speak out about bigotry, not only anti-Semitism, but others. When I'm dealing with the college campus where there's an allegation of anti-Semitism, I don't come in as an outside person to say, to wag my finger at them and say, this is horrible here, because that's not going to do anything other than, make some people feel good that somebody out there is saying that stuff. I'd much rather try to be effective and work with the administration saying, look, if you have a situation there where people feel harassed and intimidated from saying what they think, especially, it usually comes out in the context of issues of Israel, but it may be other things too, that you want to be in a situation where you reject that type of intimidation and harassment, because you're not allowing for academic freedom. So I'm working with institutions to try to make them do better in responding to issues of anti-Semitism. Because, again, to target these issues, to get them to understand it better, and to do it in a way that resonates with their own self-perception and goals.
Okay. Could you address the general idea of superiority as informing bigotry? I mean, you
Can we
touched
pause for
on
one
it
second
before.
just to see who's at the door?
Oh, I'm
okay,
sorry.
it's okay.
The issue of how the idea of superiority of a group, how that informs bigotry, generally speaking?
Well, I don't know. Again, some people may feel. I'm not going to psychoanalyze, individuals and say there are some people that were very active in different, hate groups that I don't think they saw themselves as superior to anybody else. They probably saw themselves as somewhat inferior, and that probably attracted them to a group that, sort of filled that psychological void and made them feel more important. But, in terms of the ideologies of these groups, they tend to see themselves as at risk, and that they're fighting a war for survival. And if they have anti-Semitism as a driving force in their worldview, they posit themselves as fighting against, the Jews. The Jews are trying to kill them, therefore they have to fight for their own survival. And that, is the way the Nazis looked at the world. And you see that as a common view of people that try to define the world in almost these apocalyptic terms. We have to fight for our survival, and whether that's superiority or not, I don't know. But they see some aspect of self-interest that defines their fighting for their kids and their grandkids and their way of life.
Do you have any insights on some individuals have written about, and I've interviewed some too, about who argue that there's a psychological problem in anti-Semitism, it's a mental disease, and all that kind of stuff. Did you discuss that?
I think, again, I think it's normative. I think that there are times where people may become so animated by their identity of fighting a battle that is for the survival of their own kind, like a Timothy McVeigh. He saw his identity almost solely as a white warrior against the government that he saw as doing evil things. And so, whether that's a mental disease or not, I can't say. I could say that the people that act out on these things tend to have this narrow issue of identity. They don't see themselves as, okay, for me, I'm Jewish, I'm a father, I'm a male, I'm a basketball fan, I have all these different identities at different points in my life. They tend to be driven by one. Those are that are the actors. However, there's a larger group of people that make this world run on these levels of hate groups that are not necessarily the ones that are just all driven out to to this extreme. I remember talking in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing with a reporter on a talk radio show who had written a book. A guy from the Chicago Tribune had written a book to try to keep people away from skinhead groups. Turns out to have been one of Timothy McVeigh's most favorite books, and the guy who wrote it was just absolutely appalled that what he had written to steer people away from this, McVeigh saw it as an affirmation of his core racist beliefs. And so we were getting into a discussion back and forth about who was in the militia, and he was describing them all as losers and people that came from alcoholic families and broken homes and so forth. And I was saying, no, out in Montana there were people that were respectable businessmen and others, and we were both right, because he was talking about the ones who were likely to go out and blow up a building, and I was talking about the ones who came to meetings and gave the money and saw themselves as part of it and made it more possible for these others, to act. So there's a combination of levels. I've seen some people writing. There's a guy from Harvard who's written about extreme hatred as a mental disease. As a former criminal defense lawyer, I would hate to see somebody get off on saying, well, you hated too much and therefore you're somehow not guilty. But I think it's like most things, hatred is a human condition. And if you go to an extreme on it and you let it take over your life, it could be a real disaster for a lot of people.
Why is anti-Semitism so enduring?
Well, good question. Jews have been around for thousands of years and have always been seen as sort of outsiders to the mainstream. So how people deal with this outside religion, this outside ethnic group, is part of it. I think some of the ideas are hard to let go of. Hatred, if you look at it historically, look when the Yugoslavia broke up. There were people fighting battles that were, basically 300, 400, 500 years old, and recreating them, having nothing to do with Jews, but having to do with different, ethnic groups. I think hatred is something that people remember for a long time, and it's hard to let go of. And anti-Semitism has been useful. It's certainly useful if you're looking at the current Arab and Muslim world. It's very useful to deflect, attention from things internally in those societies. You blame an outside group. It's a way to have people coalesce. So it's used politically, it's used theologically, it's used ideologically, and there's also, if you play basketball, there's something called muscle memory.
You said this, and you touched on this a little bit. Most people who act on their hatred seem to have one single aspect of their identity that becomes supercharged and all important.
Yeah, and that's what I was talking about with McVeigh. That when you give yourself over to hatred as a defining enterprise of your life, as some do, again, the McVeigh did. David Duke, who's a charlatan and a self-promoter, but also has that aspect as well, or Louis, Farrakhan and so forth. There are people that are driven by the zeal, that see, a mission that doesn't really reflect an understanding of empathy or the humanity of others. And I think that's been a real driving force of some of the people that have been either the most dangerous in terms of promoting ideologies of hate or carrying out actions of hatred.
Okay. Farrakhan, could you elaborate on his group for a while?
Sure. The Nation.
What do you know about them? And
sure. Nation of Islam is an American group that was founded by somebody named Elijah Muhammad, and Malcolm X was part of it. Farrakhan, has been in charge of it for a long time. It believes that white people, exist because there was a black scientist, I forgot the year, but I think it was 600 and something, who, I'm not sure I got this exactly right, either it was a mistake or intentional, but someplace in his lab he invented white people. So it's very similar to the sort of Christian identity view of non-whites as somehow being not fully human. Here's an idea that whites aren't fully human. They're somehow, this mistake or something that was created in a lab. And anti-Semitism is very much a part of his worldview. He's promoted Holocaust deniers. He has a book targeted to the African American community that just had a second volume come out that basically says that slavery was a Jewish enterprise to, again, classical anti-Semitism, Jews conspiring to harm a non-Jewish population. Slavery was a Jewish enterprise. What he did is he took all the references to Jews who were involved in the slave trade and ignored everybody else and put it together and made it seem just like David Irving, as a Holocaust denier, distorts history. He distorted history to make slavery seem as a Jewish enterprise.
Okay. Could you discuss, generally speaking, you say this, well, clearly anti-Semitism, which has a long-standing and to the hater logical storyline about Jews conspiring to harm non-Jews through various means, provides them with an explanation for what they see as wrong with the world, and in turn helps strengthen their group identity. So could you discuss the disdain for the other as part of the whole paradigm intrinsically?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
Well, the idea that you have this disdain for everybody else is sort of the core of your identity.
Well, it's not just the disdain for everybody. Sometimes it's very particular in who you have the disdain for. If you posit yourself as in a sort of night and day, black and white, good and evil, bad, bad and good, war against an identifiable group who you see as somehow challenging your ability to thrive or even to exist, that gets the juices flowing. And if you pull in the classic anti-Semitic tropes again that sees Jews, the protocols of the elders of Zion, Jews conspiring to make all markets go up and markets go down, and this and that, and wars and all that stuff, then there's this demonic evil that somehow is a real challenge to you. And there's a lot of literature out there and storylines that you can use to try to create this impression of. Holocaust denial is very interesting. Again, because this stuff isn't hard to do. When I first started talking about Holocaust denial, people were saying, well, this is just lunacy. I mean, everybody saw the films and knows the story, and how could they do it? Well, if you look, you take an audience and you say, okay, here's what they say about the Anne Frank diary, the seminal piece of literature coming out of the Holocaust, and they say that it's a fraud. And why do they say it's a fraud? They say it's a fraud because there's writing in a manuscript of it in ballpoint pen, which is true. They say the ballpoint pen is a post-war invention. It's true too. So they said, therefore it's a fraud. Well, you change one fact. There are emendations on a copy of the manuscript made by Anne Frank's father, Otto, in ballpoint pen. But you just move one thing out of the way, and then it sounds entirely reasonable. Or you talk about, pictures of Nazi guards smoking cigarettes outside of the, quote, alleged gas chambers, and you showed the specs of DuPont that shows Zyklon B to be an explosive gas. And said, how could this be? Somebody smoking, they would have opened the thing, the whole thing would have blown up. Well, if you look at the concentration of the gas used, it was used at a level where it wasn't explosive. But just one small fact being omitted or distorted can make this sound reasonable. And if you believe these reasonable stories, then you say, well, how could it be that the whole world believes that the Holocaust happened? It clearly didn't happen, and the Jews must have made it up, and here's the proof. So they don't create it as an impression of lunacy. They create it as an impression of these nefarious Jews somehow distorting things, and here's how they've done it.
I interviewed one scholar who said that Holocaust denial was a form of hate speech. Could you elaborate on that?
I hate the idea of hate speech. I don't buy the term. Hate speech suggests that there's certain speech that should be illegal. And I come strongly from an American context that, and also, a person who's been working on anti-Semitism for over 2 decades, that suppressing speech never works. It makes people into martyrs, and it gives them more credit than they're due. So I don't like the idea of hate speech at all. If you're asking me, is it anti-Semitism? Is it hateful? Yeah, it is, just like other claims that are anti-Semitic, are hateful. But I think the way you counter them is not to classify them as ideas that shouldn't be allowed, but you encourage people to understand why these things are hateful and to speak out against them, not to criminalize them.
Okay. You said this, and you've touched on this a bit, but I'd still like to revisit it because it's pretty interesting. You said anti-Semitism of every type treats Jews either individually or collectively as the other.
Mm-hmm.
Could you discuss that?
Well, anti-Semitism by definition sees Jews as harming non-Jews and conspiring. So it does hold Jews as a separate group, and a group to be wary of, and a group that's somehow mystical and doing contradictory things. I mean, people can believe Jews have the ability to be responsible for capitalism and communism. Just total opposites. So it allows people to see Jews as this sort of bizarre group that is almost Svengali-like in its conspiracy capabilities and its abilities to control things in the world. And by definition, that's another. That's not what you or I could do. That's what this group that somehow is a threat to us does.
Where do you fall along these lines with the Israel Lobby book by Mirsham and Ward?
Yeah.
The ADL came out, and a lot of people, they've been called anti-Semites. There's everything under the sun. There's all kinds of positions on this. Where do you stand?
I don't think it's useful to call them anti-Semites, and I don't know that they are. I think that they're wrong. I think that one of the things that they did in their analysis is basically, okay, here's how we see the U.S. national interest. And we see the U.S. national interest as, the Arab world has a lot of oil, we need oil. All the things on the ledger they define as the American interest fall on the Arab side, therefore very little on the Israel side. And they say, well, how could it be that the rest of America doesn't see this as we do? And I said, well, it has to be because of this pressure of the Israel lobby somehow making it seem different than the reality is. And how could they get away with that? There must be something weird going on here. Well, I mean, what they don't look at is, Americans appreciate the fact of a democracy in Israel compared to the other countries in the Middle East. And Americans certainly recognize that at 9/11, for example, there were celebrations in various parts of the Arab world, including the West Bank and in Gaza, whereas the Israelis declared a day of mourning. That's not even mentioned in their book. So, again, I see them as doctrinaire and ideologues. I don't see, anti-Semitism as being a motivating factor. I think that the book may be used by anti-Semites, and I think that they also don't, recognize that sure there's a political lobby that's pro-Israel in the United States. You have other political lobbies as well. They all, the gun lobby, other lobbies. That's how America works. You have lobbies for the Turks and the Greeks. That's American politics. It's sort of messy. But when they start creating the impression that there's something untoward about that, there's something, that can be used by anti-Semites, even though I don't think that was the motivating factor.
Okay. You talk about that history has shown that anti-Semitism is the miner's canary.
Mm-hmm.
Could you address that?
Well, the miner's canary theory is basically that when the worst case scenario happens in some ways, and it's tolerated, that means that other groups have therefore become vulnerable later on. So, the idea that when anti-Semitism is allowed, and in the attitudinal surveys tend to show the people that are most anti-Semitic or most bigoted against other groups. Want me to stop? I mean, the miner's canary basically means that, it's not just the Jews. It could be the other people that also will get, impacted by the way a society is going if it's tolerating anti-Semitism. And if you look at Nazi Germany as the worst case, scenario, but it was, others were also swept up in that as well. And that's one of the things I tend to, to look at when I look at how bigotry works in the society. It's not just the issue of anti-Semitism. What type of bigotry is tolerated towards a group that wouldn't be tolerated towards some other group. So part of my background is I was a trial lawyer for a lot of American Indians over the years. So I look at things like, the Washington Redskins and the Cleveland Indians. And you wonder, okay, if they were, say, Washington Blackskins with the same type of, stereotypical logo, or the New York Jews with the same type of, the payas and all that stuff, you wouldn't have it. So, but you have it against American Indians. So I see that as, okay, is that a miner's canary about the worst case scenario of bigotry that we're allowed to accept or, see as unremarkable as part of our daily culture? When there was concern about when the economy collapsed and were Jews going to be blamed, I saw, on the websites of the hate groups, and I was not terribly impressed because if I were running an anti-Semitic hate group, or hate site, I would update my material too. It's a no-brainer. I was more concerned about the fact in the mainstream media there were attacks on, quote, unworthy minorities who somehow got these loans that blew up the economy. So I see that as a miner's canary too. Now, historically, anti-Semitism has been like that, tolerated in a way that other types of bigotry would be seen and not tolerated towards other groups. And so you always have to be aware of what the worst case scenario, and too frequently it is anti-Semitism that's the one.
Is there anything unique about anti-Semitism as a bigotry?
Well, there are a number of things unique about it. I mean, first of all, because Jews are unique. Jews are both a religion, so it's not just like, anti-Islam or anti-Catholicism or whatever. Jews are also a people, so there's a nationality aspect to it too. And I think that creates a complexity to it. I think also how Jews have lived over the millennium as a minority in different countries with expulsions and so forth is a unique history, and I think that helps inform it. And again, it's because of the connection in different worlds in some ways. I think that also helps explain its longevity. For example, we were talking before about Holocaust denial as basically a product of the far right white supremacist world. But it's a way for them to communicate with the Islamic world, which sees some value in it. If you look at the growing Muslim population in Europe, and those who are influenced by some of the more radical imams and websites and satellite television programs, some of the classic anti-Semitism that came out of Europe, the ideas of the blood libel, or the protocols, and so those are not things that came out of the history of the Middle East and the Arab and Muslim world, but they're now being repackaged and sold that way. So you have ideas that came out of one historical, cultural, political environment that get reinvigorated for another, and part of that is it allows these different disparate communities to communicate and have something in common with each other. So in all those ways, I think it's unique.
Do you know anything about the Chabad? I spent this morning walking around Crown Heights.
Uh-huh.
I've never been there. Do you know anything about the Chabad?
What about them?
Do you know anything about them?
Yeah.
Well, leading to the context of anti-Semitism. I mean, I interviewed Samuel Haleman, who's, do you know who he is?
No.
He won the National Jewish Book Award from the Rebbe.
Okay.
So he's over in Queens.
Okay.
But he said that the Orthodox community took a really hard hit in the Holocaust because, for many reasons, but among them, they stand out like sore thumbs, the way they dress.
Yeah.
Could you address that?
Well, the Crown Heights community. I mean, there's about the Crown Heights riots, right?
Could you address it? I've heard about it, but could you?
Sure. Well, I mean, what happened is that in New York, there were, especially in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of white flight, and one of the groups that didn't go was the Hasidic community in Lubavitch in Crown Heights, and so there was a community there that was Lubavitch, but also Caribbean American and African American, and there were tensions back and forth over a long period of time. Some of it over disputes about who was getting services and that type of stuff. And there were some, extremist elements that were promoting, some hatred and some anti-Semitism too. Although there were also times in the past where the Lubavitch community also doing things that were perceived by the African American and Caribbean American community as somewhat racist too. And it all sort of exploded when there was a traffic accident with Schneerson had been their leader, was coming back from visiting his wife's grave, and the motorcade, somebody had an accident and killed a poor, young African American kid, and the presumption was somehow this was an attack again, by the Jews on a vulnerable community. With a lot of misinformation, the idea that somehow the ambulance came and got the Jews and not the blacks, which was totally untrue. And then there were, hate mongers, Sonny Carson, Al Sharpton at the time, and a few others who helped promote basically what was a few days of riots there. So you had Norman Rosenbaum, who was an Australian Jew, who was a scholar, who was knifed to death. Murdered in Crown Heights as part of this riot that the people there referred to as a pogrom.
I didn't know a lot of that. This individual, was he there for the purpose of researching?
I'm not exactly sure. He's part of the Lubavitch community, so I know this was sort of like where the mothership was, 770. So I don't know what exactly the reasons were that he was there, but he was there, and he happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and he was killed.
I guess that'll do it. So, am I missing anything?
I don't know. Intergalactic anti-Semitism?
Pardon?
Intergalactic anti-Semitism? That's what I would expand to.
What about that? Do you have any comments about it? Does it exist? Is there any place in the world where there's no anti-Semitism?
No, one thing he didn't ask, which is quite interesting, again, it's another unique thing about anti-Semitism, is there's anti-Semitism in places without Jews. You find anti-Semitism in Japan, you find it in China, you find it in other places, because it really isn't, at the end of the day, about sort of intergroup relations, totally about how people deal with others in their midst. It's also about ideas. So you'll have, ideas of Jewish conspiracy being sold in literature in, Japan and other places as an interesting view of the world. So it's again, those who propose. So I like the idea of hate studies rather than peace studies. Peace studies presupposes, okay, you have different groups and see how you can get them to go along. But what happens if you have hatred in a place where there's one group that doesn't even exist there? It seems to me a much more fundamental question.
Yeah, there is something I haven't hit on enough,
Sure.
and that is Islam. Because I've talked with a number of people and I've read some stuff, and it seems like when you talk about anti-Semitism today, whether it's in Europe or anywhere, Muslims come to the fore. Do you buy into that? What's your take? What's your perspective on all that?
Look, I think any religion, including Judaism or Christianity or Islam, has both things in the religion that are noble and, tolerance promoting and forward-looking and humanistic, and you have some horrible things in all religions as well that vilify others and justify that vilification. And I think that the question of what a religion is at the moment is defined largely by what its practitioners have to say about it. And I think there are some challenges in the Islamic world, but to put it into context, I was at a conference with members of Parliament a few months ago in Ottawa, where there was a discussion about things on the campus. And I have a colleague from the UK who was saying, listen, if I'm a parent of a Jewish kid going off to college campuses in the UK where there's some degree of anti-Semitism, and there is, many of them, or I'm a Muslim parent worried about my kid going to college, who's going to have the greater worry? And the greater worry, you have to concede it, has to be the Muslim parent, because the Jewish student may go there, may be uncomfortable, may have things said to him, may have classes that he feels uncomfortable taking or things he's not, feels free to express. But if you're a Muslim parent, you're worried about your kid getting sucked into a radical group that may end up being a suicide bomber. So I thought that was right. I think there's a question of how do you deal with the people in the Islamic community who've hijacked the religion for a political purpose. That's very dangerous, and it's not just dangerous. Again, your minor canary. It's not just dangerous to Jews.
Yeah, just another thing.
Sure.
Israel was formed as a refuge, ultimate refuge for the world's Jewry. There are some I've spoken with and who have argued or suggested that there's a paradox now. Israel is fueling anti-Semitism, or Israel, anti-Semitism seems to be swirling around Israel as a place, and less so everywhere else. Well, I mean,
there are two paradoxes. One is that Israel is supposed to, Jews were somehow vulnerable because they had no state, and that Zionism as an enterprise was going to make Jews safe. And to an extent that's true, but there's also what I worry about is you have statements like, Ahmadinejad talking about wiping Israel off the face of the earth, or the leader of Hezbollah talking about he's a Zionist in the sense that he wants all Jews to get in gathered so he could kill them. It is a rather attractive bullseye to those that have genocidal anti-Semitic thoughts, and that's a worry. In terms of what Israel does and whether it promotes anti-Semitism, there are things that one could be critical about Israeli policy, whether it gives some fuel to anti-Semites, is debatable. But the way I look at all forms of bigotry is that even if you can make that argument to a degree, it's intellectually dishonest and just wrong to somehow blame the victim. For example, when I'm dealing with an anti-gay hate crime, or anti-woman hate crime, you would never say, well, somehow if the gay person had done something that had made his attacker less offended by the gay person's demeanor, that would have been a good thing. So he was somehow responsible. Or if a woman is raped and she's wearing a short skirt, that somehow she's culpable. She shouldn't have dressed that way. Well, maybe if the woman had dressed a little differently, it might have made a difference. Maybe it wouldn't have. I don't know. But the point is that the action of the person that's the rapist is the responsible party, or the person who committed the hate crime against the gay person, and to somehow diminish those, they could say, if somebody has a problem with Israel. Here's why I don't like this policy, and here's why I think it's counterproductive, and here's why I think it's may even be self-destructive. But to use that as a justification to promote vilification, to say somehow that Israel's responsible for it, to me, it's just not a wise way to go. It's not the way you deal with bigotry.
Let me ask.
Sure.
I've asked a few people this. Giant can of worms. The who was a Jew question, and I like to throw it in lap. And the thing that's still Jewish peoplehood. And you hinted on it, you addressed it a little bit before. It's a very complex identity, and it's on many different levels, religion. Could you address that? What's peoplehood? Who and what is a Jew in 2011?
Well,
American Jewish Committee and all.
Well, I think Judaism is a big tent. I mean, there are Orthodox Jews, there are Reform Jews, there are Reconstructionist Jews, there are secular Jews, there are atheistic Jews, and that's what makes it complex to people who see Jews as a religion. I mean, I'm very much, I'm married to a rabbi. I'm an atheist. I've been an atheist, as far as I can remember. I'm just as much a Jew as anybody else. I, celebrate the holidays. I like the rituals. I, eat the food, probably too much, but it's a collectivity, and that's in many ways what makes it unique. I'm just because I'm not religious, just because prayer doesn't do anything for me, doesn't make me any less connected to the Jewish community and the Jewish story.
I asked a few people this question. I'd like to.
Sure.
How much and how does the Holocaust inform modern Jewish identity? And that's the ultimate expression of anti-Semitism, I guess. And what's your take on that?
The Holocaust it's a complex thing. I think on one hand, it demonstrates the logical endpoint of anti-Semitism, and so clearly there's the people that have either lived through the Holocaust or had relatives go through the Holocaust. It's something that that weighs largely. On the other hand, especially for people from the religious component, may be something that is very attractive, or other aspects of it. You don't want to define Judaism by anti-Semitism. I mean, if you do that, it's sort of like, hey, we're a sinking ship, come join us. You don't want to go there because it diminishes everything else that is an important aspect of Judaism too. I think that, I understand the idea of preserving the memory of the Holocaust and the real noble motives of the survivors who attempted to set up structures so that others could learn from what happened to them, so that things like this are less likely to happen to Jews or to Rwandans or to others. I do worry, however, that when we're looking at issues of combating anti-Semitism, there are a couple of Holocaust-related mistakes I think we make. One is that there has been so much poured into the idea of Holocaust education, which again, I don't want to be seen as saying it's unimportant. I think it is important, but almost to the exclusion of other things that we should be doing. For example, the idea of promoting credible studies of Israel and increased scholarship of Israel is something I would have loved to have seen. A little bit less Holocaust, programs and more in terms of modern Israel. And the second thing is that I think we confuse that somehow teaching about the Holocaust and Holocaust education is an antidote to anti-Semitism. That, to me, is demonstrably untrue. And I'll just give you two examples. If you take the people we were talking about, young Arab and Muslim kids in Europe, and you say, okay, let's sit you down. We're going to talk about Wannsee. We're going to talk about the Nuremberg laws. We're going to talk about this or that. And they're seeing images of Israelis with guns, in their view, victimizing people that they identify with in the Middle East. That's not going to convince them to not vilify that Israeli. Or if you take the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, you had people there who were from non-governmental organizations that I would dare say probably had more Holocaust education than the norm, and were using the language of the Holocaust, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and so forth, and using it as a way to promote anti-Semitism by vilifying the Israelis in an entirely hateful and unfair way. So the idea of teaching about the Holocaust as an antidote to anti-Semitism, to me, is problematic. And to give you a final example, there was the first U.S. State Department report on global anti-Semitism had this totally schizophrenic view of Sweden, where Sweden probably had one of the most extensive and elaborate Holocaust education programs of any country in Europe, yet was experiencing a lot of anti-Semitism. And if you talk to people in the community, it came in the anti-Israel view from the left and from the Muslim community in particular. And the U.S. State Department said, okay, we're praising what they're doing about the anti-Semitism they're facing by promoting Holocaust education. One thing has nothing to do with the other. So to the extent that we value Holocaust education, it's important. People should learn the lessons. It's the major genocide of the 20th century. It's all important, but to see it as an antidote to anti-Semitism is unwarranted and wrong.
I interviewed Michael Berenbaum,
Sure.
and he brought up Sartre, the philosopher.
Yeah.
And the issue, and I can't do justice to paraphrase what he says. I don't remember. I haven't transcribed it yet. But the essential issue, and I heard it not just from him, I pose it to you, is to what degree does anti-Semitism define modern Jewish identity, and is that a good thing? Is that an issue at all? I mean, it came up in the context of Sartre.
Yeah, anti-Semitism probably defines part of it for some people, but certainly not for most people. I mean, the idea of Jewish tradition, Jewish continuity, for a lot of people, Israel is an important component of their Jewish identity. So again, I don't know. I haven't seen survey data to suggest how much. Clearly, if you take a long lens, this is a historic tragedy that's really not all that long ago. When I was born in '53. I mean, when I remember growing up and learning about the Holocaust, I thought, oh, this sounds like ancient history. So far, and I got into my 20s and 30s and said, wait a minute, this has just happened. It was over 8 years before I was born. So it does impact people because you know relatives, you know others. And I think it had an impact not only on Jewish identity, it also had an impact, I'll somewhat contradict what I was saying a moment ago, on anti-Semitism, in the sense that the world basically saw where anti-Semitism, can lead to, and that made it not respectable for a period of time, to engage in it the way that it had been engaged in before. I remember speaking to a guy very active on the political left when I first saw anti-Semitism from the left, which was in, I think, '82 during the first Lebanon War. And I went to this guy who was one of the last Vietnam-era protesters that was in prison in Portland, State University professor, and I was a law student. I worked on his case, and I said, Frank, explain this to me. What's going on here with this vilification of Israel? It sounds very similar to what I was hearing from the far-right guys that I was, seeing around the community. And his view was, well, people in his generation remembered the people coming out of the DP camps and the people that were promoting the vilification of Israel in the 80s didn't have that point of reference and lived in a post-67 world. So I think the Holocaust has had an impact not only on Jewish identity but the identity of others, and as we move further and further away from it, I don't know what's going to have as its impact in terms of where Jewish identity is, but I think it will have a lesser counter balance to the idea of mainstreaming anti-Semitism.
And anti-Semitism on the left, could you elaborate on that?
Well, anti-Semitism on the left is an interesting phenomenon because whereas if you're on the right and you revel in the idea of vilifying Jews because you see them as demonic and so forth, on the left, and I define myself as coming from politically from the left, it's a much harder thing because you don't see any common cause of people on the far right, nor do you see vilification of Jews as anything to be proud of. Yet there's this contradiction where a lot of people on the left, or some people on the left, accept too easy a black and white view of the world, and they tend to see things as people of color, and white people and Jews are part of the white majority, and they tend to see colonialism as an explainer of a lot of the things on a global basis, and try to put Israel and the Jews there as colonial occupiers of another people, as opposed to this being a complex situation where you have two people with indigenous roots and historic claims to the same area trying to figure out how to make that all work. And so that creates problems on the left. How do you deal with that in a way that isn't entirely schizophrenic? So you do have people on the left who say, wait a minute, how can some other people that identify themselves as progressive, like I, get out in a public square in the UK, for example, and go to a rally supporting Hamas and Hezbollah? It happened a few years ago. So forget about the Jews. When I, as a progressive, I'm supporting a group that that vilifies women, doesn't let women drive, will stone gay people to death, and that's progressive. How much do you hate, Jews in a way, to be able to turn a blinder towards these other things that should cause you some, circumspection. So the challenge for me is not to vilify the left, although there's a problem in parts of the left, but I think the mistake the Jewish community is making by and large in the last decade has been, I understand why people are upset with the left, but then they default to vilifying the left and funding things on the right, where there may be useful things in terms of training people for Israel advocacy and so forth, don't get me wrong. But if this battle is being really engaged on the left, you have to help, it seems to me, people on the left who may not like Israeli policy, who may refer to the occupation as a problem and so forth, but get it when it comes to vilification and anti-Semitism. There are people like the group Engage that push back against the academic boycott in the UK. Left group, not going to be happy about all Israeli policies. They're the groups that should be funded more because they're going to help people on the left understand what it is that they're fighting for.
I interviewed Hannah Rosenthal
Sure.
in the State Department.
Yeah, she's a good
granted me
friend.
an interview. And I was surprised. Apparently, she's been at quite odds with the former Mr.
Greg
Whitman.
Rickman, yeah,
He was
I
in before. And I asked her a few questions about it, and her essential answer in that regard was Democrat-Republican. I mean, that there's a politics subliminally beneath. I mean, I guess I'm naive, but I guess, do you have any insights on that? Their common enemy, what have you, is anti-Semitism. Both of those individuals who headed that department, but there's an enormous Democrat-Republican politic that sort of muddles the way. Or something.
Well, I don't know. Their politics in D.C. big surprise. But and I've worked with Greg and I worked with Hannah, and they have different approaches and different philosophies. I mean, they're both very committed, concerned, people, and they both brought different strengths. I think Hannah, under her reign, I think that the office there has gotten much more centralized in the State Department. When Greg had it, not to diminish his work, he put out two great reports, but it was sort of outside the main State Department building. Now it's much more centralized. So again, not surprising that people have politics. Both have done valuable work, and I see this office as something that I hope will really help over the long haul to really get the State Department to understand that anti-Semitism is an issue that impacts American concerns, and it's important for somebody in that that office to help collect data on it, to talk to leaders when this comes up, and to be proactive about it.
Do you have any? Has it been effective, that office? Do you know? I mean,
yeah, I think it has been effective. I mean, I know I've worked with both of them, raising specific concerns in countries that they will turn around, and if they investigate and think it's worthwhile, will raise to officials on the ground in various places, including a country where there was an anti-Semitic attack that very little was being done about, and so that's very, very helpful. The idea of, Greg Rickman put together, like I said, the first two reports that were mandated by Congress that looked at anti-Semitism and giving a snapshot on these different countries and what they were doing about it. And the second of the two I thought was very useful because it was looking at it more by theme than by country in some ways, and using the working definition as sort of the rubric to figure out what it was that was happening in various different regions. Holocaust denial, the vilification of Israel, the classic anti-Semitism, and so forth. And what Hannah has done, which I think is the logical next step, is she's integrated into the regular human rights reports of the State Department. So it isn't just seen as, okay, we've got to do this extra report too. It's not really central to our work. Now it is central to our work. And again, it's only been around for a few years, so I see it as a very good start, and I'm especially encouraged with the work that Hannah's been doing lately.
How does your work parallel that, or is it a completely different thing?
Oh yeah, I'm not a government employee. She's a government employee. She's responsible for these issues. She works on a diplomatic level, but because we're both concerned about anti-Semitism, we're actually not only that. I mean, Hannah has been a great colleague on the whole idea of hatred as well. So when I invited her to give a keynote at the last conference of the Institute for Hate Studies, I'm looking at how we look at hatred globally. She was eager to come because she saw that enterprise of trying to get a better handle of theories to guide us in countering hatred as something that can be very useful in her work as well.
Maybe one last question.
Sure.
You've been very generous. 1967, or that era, has come up many times, the Arab-Israeli war, and there was a big turn in the Jewish community.
The outside the Jewish community as well. But I mean, the difference was, to me, that was the sort of philosophical turning point. I mean, you had it from friends. I had a friend told me, he said, I was very sympathetic to the Israelis, and then '67 happened. Well, I remember living through '67, and we were very worried whether Israel was going to survive, especially given the context of in retrospect, 48 was not all that long before, and they'd have to wipe out Israel and drive the Jews into the sea. But I think for the paradigm for many, Israel was seen, you know, as the Jew as the weak person, you know, the Holocaust victim that somehow managed to survive, and we had the, you know, the sort of the downtrodden person that's the underdog that has to be somehow supported because that's the right thing to do. And then when Israelis were not only survived but also captured, you know, the Sinai and the West Bank and Gaza, especially in the political context of the time, you know, the left and the anti-war years and so forth, the Students for Democratic Society and so forth, it got very easy to paint, you know, to reverse that story, to turn Israel into the, you know, the aggressors, the militarist, you know, group that was now oppressing others who were now the underdog. So the story got flipped, and that helped allow, again, some of the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism. It, I think, was the beginning of the slide from where, you know, people saw the refugees coming out of the Holocaust and understanding where anti-Semitism could lead to, and then just saying, well, we don't have to feel that anymore, and certainly not as strong a way, because look at what the Jews are doing now.
Okay, you've been very generous.
Oh, my pleasure.